thank you for coming back. Welcome back to Exeter. Welcome back to the 7th Annual UFO Festival. And without further ado, I'll reintroduce our MC, Richard Dolan.
I'm a big Abraham Lincoln fan. He was here, as you know, 155 years ago. If you don't know that, it's a cool thing of American history. Our funniest, wittiest, and in my opinion, deepest of the presidents was here on this stage. It's kind of an amazing thing of history. And you know, in the election year that we're having, it would be nice to have a guy like Lincoln with self-depreciating humor. He actually is really funny, and he was once accused of being two-faced. As a politician, you get that a lot. He said, hey, if I really had two faces, why would I be wearing this one? There's one other Lincoln story I just want to run by. I got it right here. Oh yeah. So Lincoln would tell these stories about like how unattractive he was. It was like a thing that he would do. And there is one story he would like to repeat. He said, I was on a train one time. I was accosted by a stranger who said, excuse me, sir, but I have an article in my possession that rightfully belongs to you. And Lincoln said, well, how is that? And the stranger takes a pocket knife out, and he says, this knife was placed in my hands some years ago with the injunction that I was to keep it until I found a man uglier than myself. I have carried it from that time to this. Allow me to say, sir, that I think you are fairly entitled to the property. Lincoln would just tell these stories. So I just think it's kind of neat that we had him here. Relating to the UFO subject, as that's why we're here, this is really the most fascinating subject of our era, of our time. It is the great discrepancy of our world, this phenomenon that goes on everywhere, truly everywhere, worldwide. Thousands of sightings in North America alone every single year, and it gets no attention from the mainstream establishment at all. That's a problem. My very good friend and colleague Peter Robbins is going to be talking about this. I've known Peter for about almost 15 years. We have been friends and I would say brothers for just about that whole time. There is no one who has gone through the field of ufology and met as many people and done as much thinking and cogitation over this as Peter. He is truly one of a kind. And he's one of these researchers as well who doesn't simply focus on one thing. We're similar in that way. We like to think about a lot of facets of this phenomenon. And I think we're both kind of philosophical about this, and we look at different aspects of it. Peter, in this talk, will be, I'm going to read this little brief description of his talk. He lays out the evidence and his conclusions, based on many years of his research, establishing how and why the so-called flagship of American journalism, that is the New York Times, was instrumental in perpetrating the greatest deception in our nation's history. That is an effort so successful that it continues to influence major media's coverage of UFOs right till today. He'll have some thoughts at the end on what we can do to begin to change this cultural impasse. So without any more waiting time, let's bring Peter Robbins. Peter.
Good afternoon. Now, for those of you here who cannot see me because of this incredibly tall podium, hi. Before I get started, I want to say with a great deal of pride, it's wonderful to be back here in Exeter, New Hampshire. I had the honor of being a co-founder of this festival 6 or 7 years ago with Dean Merchant, who can be here today. I have not been back for 3 years, and I have to tell you, I am so impressed and so moved with how a small chapter of this remarkable fraternal organization has brought this festival to this point. Without the help of these guys and the volunteers here, this event would simply not be happening. and how amazingly engaged this whole community is now. Can we have a round of applause for the people that made this possible? And now forgive me for one moment while I take about 20 seconds to walk to the spot where my intuition tells me Abraham Lincoln stood in March of 1860 to speak in this hall, to just get my energy up a little. The New York Times article you're looking at now is dated August 3rd, 1952, and I quote, "Flying saucers, or scare quotes objects as the Air Force prefers to call them, are back in the news, largely because they have been reported in the night sky near Washington, D.C. Last week they were detected by radar. 2 Army jet planes were sent after them. The pursuit came to nothing because the illuminated saucers disappeared. A technically uninformed person who does not know that the Weather Bureau and university scientists sent up balloons freighted with instruments that record temperatures, barometric pressure, wind velocity, and other facts forecasters need might naturally conclude that the formation were strange aircraft. This is an absolutely authentic photo, except that it's been colorized. This photo went out around the world in March of 1952, when thousands of residents of the greater DC area saw UFOs above the Capitol building. Despite what the New York Times had to say, the UFOs that appeared over Washington on July 2nd were truly anomalous and as real as any that have appeared in our skies since the beginning of the modern age of UFOs. For the 100th or whatever numbered time since the summer of 1947, this great newspaper's response to the phenomena reflected its ongoing mantra, "It can't be, therefore it isn't, therefore it's something else." This lockstep view of the flying saucer question and the culture of ridicule it was responsible for have remained the rule rather than the exception. But how, really, did our 1947 forefathers come to wire up what amounted to a report of something or things seen in the sky that were unfamiliar to the observer, with that individual's being deluded, strange, deceptive, mystical, a hoaxer, or a true believer? Think about it for a moment. If we lived in a relatively sane world without growing up in a culture where UFOs are a subject of ridicule, if we were friends and I ran into you on the street and I said, the damnedest thing happened yesterday. I was in the yard playing with the kids, or I was out walking the dog, and I looked up and I saw this thing or things. They weren't, or it wasn't an airplane or a kite or a blimp or a balloon or a helicopter or a formation of birds or a strange-shaped cloud or anything else. It was as big as a star, or it was as big as a battleship. It made maneuvers that go completely against any law of aerodynamics that we understand. One of them touched down on the neighbor's lawn. When it took off, there was a burn mark there, and I'm damned if I know what it was. Now, I think I'm fair to say that you would either say or think something to the effect of, "Wow, that's interesting. I wonder what it was too." It's counterintuitive. It makes no sense. And when I set about to research this subject, that was where I started. In this 1952 New York Times editorial cartoon, Uncle Sam is blasting away at a skeet disc, but it's quote-unquote not easy to shoot down. In its exhaust trail, you can just read the words, quote, "the limitless spaces of fancy." It is now long established fact that truly anomalous UFOs and their implications have been taken extremely seriously at the highest levels of our military and intelligence communities since at least the summer of 1947. More seriously, in fact, than any other matter facing this nation since the end of World War II, including the development of the nuclear bomb. Why then, had the overwhelming majority of relevant news reports from the 40s on been subjected to a level of ridicule, sarcasm, and being demeaned to such a degree that there's no other subject in the history of modern Western journalism that comes close to it. One thing is certain: the involved offices and agencies intent on keeping us in the dark about this have, to a great degree, been aided from the start by major media. In February of 1953, their handiwork was formalized by the CIA in the form of recommendations made by the Robertson Panel report, but by then the fix had been in for years. In fact, the job was done by the end of July of 1947. Less than a month, and the American people were completely conditioned. Why is it, back then, that not a single editor, journalist, or reporter for any of the nation's leading newspapers rose to the challenge and authorized or conducted a serious investigation of this serious, widespread, and genuinely compelling mystery? Journalists do not choose their careers to make a lot of money. They're actually overall intelligent, principled people that live for a good story or something to investigate. They take pride in their work. It seems like almost an impossibility that it never happened. The fact is that if any of them had, it never saw the light of day, no question about it. How did it come to pass? And at least equally important, was it somehow set in motion intentionally? And if so, by who? Another editorial cartoon from the Times, 1952, an allegory for the cost of living rising, and the quote is, "No question about the flying saucer." All of the news coverage that I'm going to refer to in this talk is drawn from a single source, that being the Times. It's supported by selected declassified military and intelligence documents, chronologically in sync with the articles. Why did I choose the New York Times? Its honorary title, as my dear friend and colleague Richard Dolan mentioned, is the flagship of American journalism. The Times has been in print since before the Civil War, and that title is well earned. And whatever any of us think about the paper's editorial policies over the decades, the Times was and remains a major player in American and world journalism today. However, back in the days following World War II, when Americans were getting a small percentage of their news from radio, none from television, really wasn't around, the New York Times was the most powerful, most distinguished, and most influential newspaper in the United States. And make no mistake about it, the other major dailies took their cue from it or reacted to it. That includes the Copley Syndicate papers coming out of Boston, the Hearst papers coming out of San Francisco, and essentially hundreds of newspapers around the United States. Reading many of the articles that appeared in other American dailies over the years, I am more than convinced that my view is absolutely the way it was. To give you a little idea of how some of us go about doing our work, this investigation necessitated my locating and printing out every article, editorial, commentary, letter to the editor, photo and photo caption that the New York Times has ever carried. By my count, that's about 230 odd pieces over almost 70 years now. I began in the old analog days as a New Yorker living in Manhattan. I'd visit the New York Times newspaper more. You would find a reference to an article in big old pebble-bound ledgers. They were like something out of Charles Dickens, all with cross-referencing numbers. You then got the number. You went to the microfiche editor, and like doing a research paper for some of us in the old days in high school, you would then print out the paper. I made it my business to print out every single article. I then put them in order, and I started to read them. My training is as a painter and a film historian. I became obsessed with this subject about 40 years ago and applied my non-standard thinking and coming at things from angles that a trained investigator might not. And what I felt is if I read it enough times, at a certain point, a pattern would emerge, whether it was a front page article or a tiny paragraph on page 18. And honestly, after reading it through 5 or 6 times, and it's a lot to read. I'm an insomniac. I do my best work between about 1 and 3 in the morning. I only need about 5 hours sleep, and at about 1 in the morning, on a 5th or 6th reading, I saw it. It was essentially, again, whether a huge article or a tiny one, this is what the report is. This is what somebody alleges. These are the many things it might be. And literally every one that they presented to the reader was nonsensical. It was the worst kind of pseudoscience. Many authorities are quoted. Often they're not even named. So that is how I began that project. Also, you should be aware that the smattering of articles that I'll be quoting from, based on how many there are honest representations of the coverage. Nothing was cherry-picked to support my point of view or any agenda that I had. This is the way it was. I would say approximately 98% of all of the New York Times coverage fell into this category. I ask you to pay particular attention to the form as well as the content. How these news writers covered their subject was as masterful in its deceit as it was destructive to any real spirit of open inquiry. Never underestimate the power of language, whether in the service of advancing the truth or stifling it. A favorite, 3 aliens in a cup and saucer, ha ha ha. I did too see a blue ball of light. Following the first wire service reports of Kenneth Arnold's June 24th, 1947 UFO sighting, then the Roswell Daily Records, Roswell, New Mexico, of course, initial report of the crash of an unknown craft outside of the town. Major media has reported on UFO stories, just not accurately. You should be aware that local papers all over the country have always covered this story as well, but almost always honestly and accurately. The ridicule that attached to local papers, most of them weeklies, was, Joe Smith says he saw this in the sky. The next week, in a letter to the editor, a neighbor or somebody in the same community might respond, well, that's nonsense. We all know it's nonsense because that is what our trusted news sources are telling us. The Times actually chose to ignore the initial reports coming in from Washington State that had been brought to public attention by a private pilot and businessman named Kenneth Arnold. He observed, depending on the account that you read, somewhere between 9 and 12 disc-shaped objects kind of cut out in back, moving in a line, and based on his experience as a pilot, measuring the time it took for them to pass by Mount Rainier and come to another mountain, they were going somewhere between 12 and 1,800 miles an hour in the summer of 1947. The story was only picked up by the news because a few days before, a private plane had gone down in the Cascade Forest, and there were reporters at the airport when he landed. And one of them asked him, what did they look like? How did they behave? He said it was though you were skimming stones across the water, like a saucer, kind of flying. The phrase flying saucer, I think, was chosen because it was kind of quirky and mocking from the start. But the Times ignored the coverage. Most other papers in the country paid particular attention to it. Then, believe it or not, the Times' very first article on the UFO phenomena appeared on July 4th, Independence Day, 1947, and began with the following words. A preliminary inquiry into the reports that strange quote-unquote flying discs have been whizzing at 1,200 miles an hour over the western states, quote, has not produced enough fact to warrant further investigation, end quote, an Army Air Forces spokesman said today, end quote. It concluded with a statement from an unnamed meteorologist from Langley Field, now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Quote, These meteorological maybes may be solar reflections on low-hanging clouds produced by spectral flashes which might have appeared like moving objects, that a small meteor might have broken up, that icing conditions in high clouds produced large hailstones which might have flattened out and glided a bit, end quote. And we have all seen hailstones flatten out and glide a bit, haven't we? This is how the most respected newspaper in the United States, whose motto was and remains all the news that fit to print, began their historic coverage of this most important phenomena in human history. This is a fair example of the kind of reporting that was being pioneered by the Times. Take an actual report, followed by some seemingly scientific authority, citing a string of pseudoscientific nonsense which always excluded what was already obvious to our military and intelligence communities, namely that we might be dealing with a genuine incursion of non-human intelligences. It's worth noting here that in July, that same month, the distinguished Foreign Affairs publication carried an article titled On Containment. It was written by a then unknown, brilliant graduate student of political science under the pseudonym of X. In it, the author laid out what was arguably a visionary plan of action calculated to contain the Soviets within the borders they had expanded to by the end of World War II. George Kennan's visionary idea was quickly adopted as the official policy of our government, and the potential for a hot or shooting war was circumvented by a so-called Cold War. Containment went on to govern our relationship with Moscow for the next 45 years, and George Kennan became policy advisor to President Truman and 9 presidents who would follow him, right up through Clinton. The man lived to be 101 years old. Why this brief digression? Simply to make the point that the Cold War and the modern age of UFOs began at the exact same moment in history. July 6 coverage observed that while scientists were at a loss to explain them, these unknown phenomena might well be, quote, pranks of nature perpetrated by the popular imagination, end quote. Not surprisingly, the newspaper's first saucer-related editorial literally oozed sarcasm from the get-go. It begins, "The annual sea serpent has been taking a much-needed rest this summer, but while Old Reliable has been lying low, those sky-skimming saucers have been flying high. Their natural habitat appears to be the Pacific Northwest, but they have now been, quote-unquote, observed from California to Nova Scotia. For weeks, the incredible discs," and we are talking about the sighting on the 24th, 2 weeks, "have been zooming across the horizon at 3 times the pace of sound. That's fast going on anybody's speedometer," end quote. The editorial continues to degenerate from there. The next day, the Times published 2 articles on the phenomena. One is titled, Wash Tubs Fall and Vanish, and referenced sighting reports now coming in from all over the country. The other was this: military planes hunt sky discs with cameras in vain, and includes a statement from General Carl Spaatz, then Commandant for the Army Air Forces and also the first head of the United States Air Force, which actually went into being in September of '47. Quote, Commander of the Air Forces, who quote-unquote just happened to be in the Northwest at the time. Quoting the general, "I've been out of touch with things for 4 or 5 days." He then departed for Medford, Oregon, and a fishing trip, end quote. By now, seemingly legitimate reports of flying discs were coming in from 33 states and included reports from a respectable number of commercial airline pilots. That day, other newspapers around the country and around the world carry the headline story that a flying disc had crashed in New Mexico. Even so, the Times made the editorial decision to completely ignore it. The following day, the Times lead article, "Discs Soar Over New York, Now Seen Aloft in All Colors." Here the Times notes, quote, "The flying saucer those still adept at eluding the most powerful telescopes in America, continued yesterday to flash in increasing numbers and variety before the googling eyes of rooftop and roadside amateurs. Despite the humorous skepticism of scientists and military experts, the latest flock of rumors showed increasing imagination. In some cases, they were in technicolor, with orange the predominant hue. A professor of physiology, unnamed, put forth the theory that the sightings were, quote, due to the effect of red corpuscles of blood passing in front of the retina. I know that's going to be a surprise to many of you who have had sightings yourself. Get your eyes checked. The War Department announced that it is, quote, dumping the whole matter in the lap of the Air Forces. One scientist, also unnamed, suggested the library as a clue, referring particularly to a section of the book Alice in Wonderland, and I quote, "Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder where you're at. Up above the sky so high, like a tea tray in the sky." On April 8th, that same day, the Air Forces issued a flying saucer directive under the heading Propaganda. Its primary concern, to investigate statements of certain persons reported in the press to have seen flying discs, and the need to, quote, to select the more qualified observers of flying discs and to secure detailed statements from them. It also decided to ask AMC, Air Materiel Command, for any possible explanations it might have. And here we go. The following day, on the 9th, the Times publishes the explanation for the story they ignored on the Roswell crash. We know what's coming from the first sentence. Quote, celestial crockery had the Army up in the air for a few hours yesterday before an Army officer explained that what a colleague, the extraordinarily decent man, Major Jesse Marcel, whose life was ruined that day by being ordered to pose by the remains of a mogul weather balloon, when the day before he had posed by the real wreckage, thought that a flying disc is nothing more than a battered Army weather balloon. Other celestial crockery have now been sighted above 44 states, as well as Australia, England, Mexico, Canada, and South Africa. The very next day, on July 10th, FBI Special Agent in Charge, D.L. Ladd, sends this classified memorandum to Director Hoover and Deputy Director Clyde Tolson. In it, Ladd recommended, quote, that we advise the Army that the Bureau does not believe it should go into these investigations, it being noted that a great bulk of the alleged discs found have been pranks. It is not believed that the Bureau would accomplish anything by going into these investigations. In fact, Ladd was completely incorrect. There was the tiniest number, you could count them on one hand, of hoaxes at that time, and still very few. Tolson agreed, however, and signed off on the memo. Hoover did too, as well, but with the following memorable reservation noted here in his own very distinctive handwriting, quote, I would do it, but before agreeing to it, we must insist upon full access to discs recovered. For instance, in the IA case, the Army grabbed it and would not let us have it even for cursory examination. This should have changed the world. This really happened. This is 1947. And within a week, General Shulgin's office responded that they would give the FBI access to discs released. Understand also that this paperwork is gilt-edged. This is authentic, declassified military intelligence FBI documentation. Saucers may be a mighty Russian discus, Gromyko hints, or else the Soviet chief observes British are exporting too much whiskey to the U.S. War propaganda, says Orville Wright. Orville Wright. The silliness has now been elevated to a new level, but by Soviet Deputy Foreign Secretary Andrei Gromyko. Let's remember that Gromyko was Stalin's mouthpiece and spokesman in the United States at this delicate moment in history, and that the Soviets at the time were fully dedicated to the destruction of the United States and certainly no friend of the Truman administration. Nonetheless, in this particular issue, Gromyko might as well have been a member of the staff of the New York Times. The actual reporter responsible for the article again attacks the credibility of the Roswell crash by stating that, quote, the United States press recorded that a blistering rebuke was sent from Army Air Force's headquarters to the Roswell Air Base, citing it for having somewhat prematurely, quote unquote, discovered a disk and publicly disclosing the fact. Sky seems normal after saucer scare. Publicity agents strive to utilize the idea. The 12th of July. The newspaper devotes valuable space to a story about a publicity agent who has mailed out paper plates with his client's name printed on them, and that a second publicity agent has announced that a radio program would feature a song entitled Flying Saucer Blues. A poll conducted among professors of geology, physics, and psychology at the City College of New York concludes that there is no evidence to substantiate the existence of the disks and that they were most likely balloons or optical illusions. Readers then learn that a disk turned over to the FBI in Twin Falls, Idaho, is identified as a pair of symbols that had been placed face to face and welded together. So reports the most respected and influential newspaper in the United States. July 17th's lead editorial is titled Science in Review. Flying saucers are considered in the light of other strange visual phenomena. The newspaper takes a less shrill, more pseudo-reflective point of view, reminding its readers that we, and like the Soviets, are now testing new missiles over the Atlantic and Pacific. Further quoting, we have read enough about the V-3 rockets that have been sent up from White Sands, New Mexico, about the heights that they reach, about the speeds at which they travel. Possibly we have here the trigger, in italics in the Times, that was pulled to in susceptible minds as far apart as New York and Australia, if there is a wish to believe it. Then another new approach is trotted out, quote, even scientists have been known to, quote unquote, see things. Astronomers who are convinced that Mars is not dead have seen fine lines that the late Professor Percival Lowell regarded as ditches dug to carry water from melting polar snow to the acrid, torrid zones of the planet. Now, of course, we know there's no water on Mars, so there's no reason to further that inquiry. That's a joke. Vagaries of vision are discussed, as in changes in the volume of blood in the retina, which might account for modest changes in vision. The same for changes in the density and volume of the fluid which fills the eyeball itself. We also learn that some ophthalmologists, unnamed surprisingly, have suggested the flying saucers may actually be, and I'm quoting here, flying flies, the alleged term for shadows thrown on the eye itself due to changes in the fluid in the eyeball, and in the process, elevating pseudoscience to a brand new level. With all of this nonsensical disinformation now being fed to the American people, what's actually being expressed behind the scenes in the world of officialdom? This distinguished gentleman is General Nathan M. Twining, who went on to become Chief of the Air Force, and on the 23rd of July, General Twinings, then the head of Air Materiel Command, issues his famous secret directive opinion concerning flying discs, also known as the Twining Memorandum. In it, he discusses the possible origin and specifics of the unknowns and states unequivocally, the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. Then goes on to describe the craft-type configuration that have been observed. This, of course, was a very in-house document. Does Twining become the target of ridicule for expressing the sober evaluation? Anything but. He will go on to become the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. One weird sky What's it plucked from flying saucer mythology? Princeton identifies visitation over New Jersey shore as 9 clusters of balloons used in the Navy neutron research. On July 27th, following the editorial protocols, now defining the New York Times UFO coverage, and now reflected in the tone and content of the other national dailies as well, reporter Meyer Berger writes, quote, "Of the weird things that streaked, floated, turned and tumbled in the eastern seaboard skies again this weekend and yesterday have been identified and removed from the flying saucer mythology. It was a chain of 9 clusters of balloons. The fiery-tailed phenomena cited in Yakima, that's in Washington, may turn out to be a rocket." So ended the New York Times July 1947 coverage of the flying saucer phenomena. By the end of that summer, every major newspaper in America had joined in the fun and were publishing articles and editorials exhibiting the same snarky, superficial, dismissive attitude. Not one of them went up against the prevailing tide of information. Think about that for a minute. Any newspaper editor should have, could have, and why didn't they, assign a reporter to look into this? Credible individuals were seeing incredible things all over this country, all over the world. It's the kind of story that you would think a real reporter would live to cover, and it never happened. Not one of them bothered to initiate a serious investigation into why the subject had been dealt with so shabbily. Instead, the Times and the other national dailies continued on as they had since July. The dismissive coverage continued on through the summer, into the next year, and the next, and the next, and to a degree really has not stopped. But the fact was that it was all done. It was locked in. It was fixed by the end of July of 1947. That means our parents, in many cases our grandparents, many of them open-minded, thoughtful, intelligent, decent people, bought into this. Again, you look up, you see something you can't identify, you mention it to somebody. This is how it happened. This is how it happened. By 1949, in February, the Air Force issued a very secret, full report, about 40 pages. If there's another one that came out before then, it's deeply classified still, and we don't know about it. And it was not released as a result of the Freedom of Information Act. It's one of the great things of the Carter administration, the Freedom of Information Act, where a citizen, you or me or anybody, using their common sense or a little booklet that you could get from the Department of Printing for $1.75, taught you how to create a legal action against the United States government to cause the release of a document that was relative to a subject that you were interested in learning more about. I've initiated a lot of them over the years. I know people that have done hundreds of them. Under the Reagan administration, it was tightened up considerably. And the first use of it was a lot by UFO researchers. However, before the Carter administration, documents were being declassified. It was a process by which, and they can't do it anymore because there are millions and millions and millions of documents that have secret classifications and a relatively small staff to review them. You know, Richard Dolan's books, UFOs in the National Security State, are prophetic. And for me, our whole national security state post-war, it did not begin with keeping the secrets around the bomb. Visualize the secret keeping as a piece of the secret that you want to cover up as a piece of sand in an oyster that irritates the oyster. And it starts to coat it with a hard film and coat it again and coat it again and coat it again. this is how pearls are formed. Somewhere under Fort Meade, Maryland, there's a pearl bigger than this building, allegorically. It didn't begin with a secret about nuclear weaponry. It began with the UFOs. They are at the center of the national security state in which we live. It's tragic, but it's true. And they'll never get to declassify. But the old method of declassification was very good. Every 3 years, a document was subject to review. And after 12 years of this process, if it was not considered a necessary secret for the state to keep, it was quietly declassified and placed in the appropriate filing cabinet in the National Archives, where researchers like myself sometimes would come upon them. The champion is Stanton T. Friedman, the greatest guy in the world, the most extraordinary longevity, who is still kicking major ufological butt at 82 years old. Now it's changed a lot, though, and it's part of the tragedy of our times. However, that's how the Project Sign was declassified. It was done before the Freedom of Information Act, where one day a researcher came upon it. And in my research, in my community of friends and colleagues, it has been public knowledge for probably 30 years or so. Again, it's about a 40-page report, and most of it is boring bureaucratese. It goes through, as it should, every possible thing they may be. And then in proper deductive reasoning, it's dismissed and they go on to the next. However, by the time you get to about page 25, things get interesting. The heading is spaceships. And I should tell you that in doing the research in the New York Times newspaper morgue, I was thrown off for a bit. I had to come up with every term that it might be filed under, knowing that it wasn't until 1955 or 56 that the term unidentified flying object, or UFO, came into popular use. So it was flying saucers, flying discs, aerial discs, unidentified aerial phenomena, discs being spelled with a C or a K. I couldn't find a single reference in the ledgers to extraterrestrial or spaceships until I stumbled on the fact that in 1947, those two words did not exist in the English language. They were always printed separately. Space, ship, extraterrestrial. And then I was able to move forward again. But on page 25, for me, as a young investigator, I hit pay dirt and something very exciting happened. Under this heading of spaceships, a real human voice emerged and said the following. The following considerations pertain. If there is an extraterrestrial civilization which can make such objects as reported, then it is most probable that its development is far in advance of ours. A modest understatement. Here's the deal. Such a civilization might observe that on Earth we now have atomic bombs and are fast developing rockets. In view of the history of mankind, they should be alarmed. We should therefore expect at this time, above all, to behold such visitations. Recommendations: the file should be continued. Let that sink in for a second. For me, it's the best plot line of the best science fiction movie ever written. They are acknowledging that in view, and I would not even say mankind, I would say man. Women don't create this insanity in this world. It's us guys. But what a visionary observation, and saying it absolutely bluntly. This is exciting stuff. And, 999 out of 1,000 people don't even know it exists. In February of 1953, a secret panel composed of CIA consultants, advisors, and members of the Central Intelligence Organization agencies met in secret for 5 days to brainstorm. And to the best of my knowledge, in the Robertson panel is the first use I have ever come upon in the English language of the word debunk or debunking. I may have missed something earlier, or that word was actually invented by the CIA in 1953. What they were there to do was essentially to codify the pattern of deceptive news coverage which had been coming at the people of the United States for the previous 7 years. In these meetings, they actually sat down to codify this method of deception. And what actually occurs is this. There is a training aspect and a debunking aspect to what they're doing. The training aspect will result in the explaining away of all authentic UFO phenomena as unusually illuminated objects such as balloons, aircraft, reflections, meteors, fireballs, mirages, translucent clouds, and other natural phenomena. The aim of the debunking part of the program will in fact result in, quote, reduction of public interest in flying saucers, which today evoke such a strong psychological reaction. This education could be accomplished by mass media, such as television, motion pictures, and popular articles. Basis for such education would be actual histories, which had been puzzling at first, but later explained. As in the case of conjuring tricks, there is much less stimulation if the secret is known. Such a program should tend to reduce the current gullibility of the public and consequentially their susceptibility to clever hostile propaganda. And the rest, as they say, is history. But now we come to the big question. All this, well and good, I think I've made my point. Was it just an accident? How did this start? Again, it's so counterintuitive. What I think happened was this. Within 48 hours of the Kenneth Arnold sightings, at the highest levels of the military and industrial community, they knew we were faced with a possible presence of intelligent beings from off the earth in machines of extraordinary high technology. Can you imagine the buzz going on around the Oval Office at this moment? Very quickly, as we now know, the President of the United States created a study committee made of 12 men, and I'm referring here to something called MJ-12 or Majestic 12, which ufologists and to a degree historians have been arguing since 1987 when it broke big. I'm one of those people who is convinced that that initial 8-page briefing document to President-elect Eisenhower in late 52, with a 1-page letter attached dated in September of 1947 from President Eisenhower to the new and the first Secretary of Defense, James Vincent Forrestal, are authentic. Since then, literally hundreds of pages of documentation purporting to be MJ-12 materials have emerged one way or another. Some of them may well be authentic. Some of them may well be, and maybe the likelihood is a great majority may well be, not just disinformation, but extremely effective, studied, and in a sense brilliant disinformation. One little side project I took myself on years ago was there is a series of documents purported to have been written by Robert Oppenheimer, co-creator of the atomic bomb. Another, a letter from Einstein, also a ranking member of the Manhattan Project. People have a habit of linguistic quirks. Some of us will invert a preposition. We'll substitute a semicolon for a comma. We will do things like that. We may have a misspelling that always follows us. I compared on my own to the writings of these people and others, and it's good. I mean, it's good. Which suggests to be something almost as interesting, that if they didn't write it, somebody took an awful lot of time to research the nuances. The typewriter faces are correct for the ones that would have been in use at that time, etc. Well, what I think happened is within 48 hours of the Kenneth Arnold sightings, either without the president's directly ordering it to preserve what we call plausible deniability, or ordering it, 1, 2, or maybe 3 men were charged with the responsibility of making overnight trips to Washington, to San Francisco, to the Midwest, to New York, to meet with the heads of the most powerful media organizations in the world. Hearst in San Francisco, David Sarnoff, head of NBC in New York, Copley family leaders, the owners of the New York Times, and imparted to them one of two things. Either you know what's happening this summer in terms of how the Soviets are establishing themselves as the next threat. You know, here we are. We've just helped to make the world safe for democracy, in part with the help of media leaders like yourself. We are posed now with something that may even be worse. Sooner or later, they may get the bomb. And the potential for mass panic of people thinking that, you know, beings from outer space are coming here right now would not serve the national interest. Again, I can't prove this. This is based on years of study, deductive reasoning, critical thinking, but I cannot come up with anything else. And that if you will give an instruction to your editors to let your reporters know that policy has been set on this subject and that they should cover this subject in a somewhat less than serious manner, it would be appreciated at the highest levels. That may have happened. It's equally possible, bearing in mind that these wealthy white men millionaires, who probably did consider themselves good patriotic Americans with the responsibility to inform the American people, might have been sworn to a security oath by a ranking member of the Truman administration and then told. There is a very good possibility that these things are what we fear they are. Advanced technology under intelligent control from parts unknown, whose intentions we have no idea about, but who fly circles around us. We cannot touch them. And let's remember, and this is referred to in more than one American document, it goes back to something that happened in the entertainment industry 9 years before. An absolutely brilliant actor, writer, producer, director, who at the time was all of 23 years old, heading a radio theater, the Mercury Theater of the Air, that worked out of the NBC building in the 30s, named Orson Welles, took the classic H.G. Wells 1900 novel, War of the Worlds, and he hired a terrific radio scriptwriter named Howard Fass to make it into a treatment for radio play. Most of you know about it. Some of you have heard it. If you haven't heard it, listen to it. It's online, and it's brilliant. But it's a radio play. It had commercials. It collapses weeks into a brief radio show segment. However, it was so powerful and so effective to this less sophisticated American audience that when they went to radio commercials, people ran to their phones. People on Manhattan Island by the thousands ran to the Hudson River to see New Jersey in flames. Television lines around the United States couldn't handle the traffic. There were a handful of coronaries, strokes, nervous breakdowns. If you want to corroborate this for yourself, there is a rather dry but fascinating book written by a Princeton-based scholar named Hadley Cantrell called The Mass Psychology, The Attack from Mars, I think, is the actual title. The Mass Psychology of Panic, or I may be inverting that, I didn't write it down. They refer to the panic following this broadcast. Well, if this happened, for me, I limit it to 3 men who were the closest to Truman in this sense. One was this gentleman. That's not. How about that? One was James Vincent Forrestal, who I've done a lot of definitive research on. History tells us he, during the course of being treated for nervous breakdown in Bethesda, Maryland, he jumped out of a window and killed himself. I think I have proved that he was murdered. The other was, for me, the most interesting scientific personality of the 20th century who almost nobody knows about, Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was Roosevelt's, then Truman's, science and technology advisor. If you go to a who's who from the late 40s, tiny little print, Vannevar Bush takes up 2.5 pages. He was the head of everything from director of MIT to chairman of the board for AT&T. The other one was Sidney M. Sowers, an Army, a Navy admiral who was indeed the very closest intelligence advisor to President Truman. For years, they had breakfast together every morning together alone, and Sowers would brief Truman on this. What I haven't done has been to go to the archives, where the papers of these 3 great men are housed, to find in their appointment books whether they were out of town at all on any of those days. It wouldn't prove anything. It would just be some more interesting smoke, but no smoking gun. In closing, perhaps, in better understanding how and why this policy was first set in motion, we can begin to make our peace with what these men at the highest levels of government, military, and intelligence felt they were faced with. Maybe, in doing so, we can go forward and help create a climate in the public at large, within the UFO research community, and with our relations in ufology to the media, where we can pioneer the way to a new climate of honesty and integrity in reporting them, in reporting this phenomena. And in the course of it, forgive and move on. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Peter. Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. The New York Times, and there was an operation in the Cold War known as Mockingbird, which was outed actually in a Rolling Stone article by Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame. And he talked about the CIA's relationship with mainstream media, and predominantly it was the New York Times. Peter, thank you so very much.
From Exeter, and we are having our UFO Festival. We sell these gorgeous t-shirts to raise money for our Kiwanis charities, and the Exeter Kiwanis supports all. Our big thing is Head Start, and which needs a lot of help, and we did the heliport up in the hospital, and we give Broslow bags to the ambulances. We try to help anything to help local kids. That was the original article. So, we love your support, and we're having a lot of fun with this UFO Festival, which is making us lots more money, and we're having lots more time than we ever did doing road races or golf tournaments.
So do the funds go directly to the hospital?
they go to us, and then we give them to whatever we're supporting. Like we do camperships, we do scholarships, and we do Christmas parties for the Head Start kids, things like that.
Cool. So are you enjoying the festival so far?
Oh, festival is so much fun. Yeah, we got so many cool people coming.